Hi, this is Courtney Campbell.
Ashley McBrien.
I'm Brianna Lax.
We are in Mr. Reed's second hour Model It class, and our art movement is minimalism. We're going to talk about the history of the movement, the art itself, the artists, their critics, and minimalism's influences on today. Minimalism started in the early 1950s and lasted until the early 1970s. The term was first used as a derogatory term for works of a manner that Richard Wilhelm said had minimum art content. As we all know, there was a plethora of social, political, and economical change in this time period. New scientific developments were also affecting the way society acted, functioned, and thought. In the 1960s, this new art movement was mixed with bold fashion and rock and roll music. It comes from the background of geometric abstraction. It's the opposite of abstract expressionism. The movement wanted to remove all feelings from art. Another influence on minimalism was Marcel Duchamp and his ready-mades. He started the thinking that sculpture could be made out of prefabricated, non-traditional materials. Minimalism is also seen as similar to pop art, with, quote, anonymous design, deadpan flatness, and an unadulterated or industrial color, end quote. It was in fact called imageless pop in 1966. One of the biggest influences on this movement was Russian constructivism, and mainly Vladimir Tatlin. He stripped artwork of all symbolic meaning. He used aluminum, glass, and steel. This was an act of support for the revolutionary aims of the new Russian Republic. The steel art, which is characterized by geometric shapes and primary colors, largely influenced this movement as well. Other arts, such as music, and the composers John Cage and Lamont Young influenced minimalism greatly. An important social aspect of this art was that this was the first generation of artists that were university educated, so many explained their works in writing. Another social aspect of this art movement came with the counterculture of the 60s, and the way that this movement wanted to shift the thinking was reflected in this counterculture. During the 1960s, the United States experienced its longest uninterrupted period of economic expansion in history. In the 1960s, housing and computer industry overpowered automobiles, chemicals, and electrically powered consumer durables, which were the leading sectors in the 1950s. Big business dominated the domestic economy during this time. In 1962, the 5 largest industrial corporations accounted for over 12% of all assets in manufacturing. By 1965, General Motors, Standard Oil of New Jersey, and Ford had larger incomes than all the farms in the United States. America's overseas investment increased to $49.2 billion in 1965.
Primary structures, structurist art, cool art, literalist art, ABC art, or Bragnon art. Whatever term you prefer, they are all referring to the same art movement, minimalism. Minimalist art is that which has a trend in design and style where the subjects are reduced to their necessary elements. It is art that is stripped down to the minimum values and elements that make up art. Here you can see some examples of minimalist art from 5 of the most prominent minimalist artists: Frank Stella, Donald Judd, Sol LeWitt, Dan Flavin, and Carl Andre. Ashley will go more in depth about each of these artists and their unique styles next. Minimalism can be seen in all forms, including painting, sculpture, dance, music, fiction writing, architecture, and fashion. Minimalist fashion has many of the same elements as minimalist sculpture. It is very simple and stripped down to the basic forms, as you can see by these examples. Minimalist architecture has all the same elements, especially in terms of geometric shapes and minimal aesthetics features. Minimalist paintings are very color and shape focused. These in particular are focused on color. Minimalist artists are similar in terms of their sensibility rather than their style. Their sensibility all comes from the same basis. putting many elements together in a work to make up simple arithmetical arrangements so that each individual element is equal to all the rest. In other words, no single element is superior or inferior to any of the others. These elements are material, structure, space, and color. Individually, they are simple, but their interplay creates a new level of multiplicity and complexity. Each of the following pieces of art has all of those elements incorporated into them. For example, the piece by Donald Judd has two types of material, metal and plexiglass. The structure is very geometric and organized. The space is very focused around the light reflecting off the plexiglass between the boxes. The color of the plexiglass creates a whole new element to the piece, and it would not be the same without this element. It isn't necessary for a work to have a lot to look at, to compare, to analyze, one by one, to contemplate. The thing as a whole is what is interesting. The main things are more alone and more intense, clear, and powerful. Donald Judd. Donald Judd is very focused on the connection between elements, which is the most important part of minimalism. He concentrates on different colors and materials. His structure and space are practically identical in the pieces on this slide. However, the differences in color and material make them not similar at all in terms of minimalism. Materials. Minimal art is made from industrial materials that people would not usually associate with art, including metal, wood, plexiglass, neon, and fluorescent tubing, mirrors, bricks, stainless steel, cloth, vinyl, styrofoam, galvanized iron and aluminum, and rubber. Plexiglass, light tubes, and metal are the three most used materials in minimalism. These pieces here are made from materials that look industrial and not artistic. These materials are chosen for their density, rigidity, opacity, uniformity of composition, and roughly geometric shape. Their meaning, if there is one at all, is function and utility. Each different material creates a new work of art, determined by the characteristics of that material. The piece by Carl Andre shows the strength and rigidity of the materials used. The piece by Donald Judd shows the right angles of the cube and the metallic look of the metal. Go to the things themselves, Husserl. No object implies the existence of any other, Hume. The piece by Carl Andre shows the metal as itself, the way it is without needing anything else or any other objects. It is as simple as that. It is just itself as metal, and there is no other point to it. There is no other implied meaning or existence of anything else. The piece by Donald Judd shows the same things and its own elements being themselves without needing anything else. Structure. The way they constructed their works of art, minimalist artists acted more like architects, which partly comes from the influence of Russian constructivism on minimalism. The materials are purposely factory-made to achieve formalist-type production and remove all of the artist's personal beliefs from the work of art. They also did not use organic materials, as those could have biological implications that they didn't want. Sometimes they used plywood, which was often painted or left plain, but they did not consider this to have the same biological implications. They attempted to remove all traits of art from the piece. It was intended to look like it was made, not composed. A simplification of format and technique implies that the work has no meaning beyond its material components and its construction. The pieces on this slide show the basic structures of minimalism. These works of art look more like construction and architecture than the art we generally think of. The main organizing principles are the right angle, the square, and the cube. These geometric shapes can either be single or repeated to make up the work. This type of formulaic organization is one of the defining components of minimalism. The piece by Donald Judd shows the effect that right angles can create. The piece by Sol LeWitt shows how right angles create squares, which create cubes, which when put together create more cubes. The piece by Dan Flavin incorporates the light with the same concept of cubes and right angles. Simplicity of shape does not necessarily equate with simplicity of experience. Robert Morris. The piece by Frank Stella appears to be simple with circles and squares, but once you look into it, the complexity increases. The more you look into the piece, the more you can see it. The piece by Sol LeWitt appears to be simple right angles and cubes, but the way the cubes are stacked together creates a new experience. Also, looking at the piece from different angles creates a new experience in terms of the space and the awareness that you have with the object itself. Space. Space is one of the key elements of minimalism. For this reason, the works of art are often placed on walls, in corners, and directly on the floor. This shows the gallery as an actual place, making the viewer aware of the space as they are moving through it. The placement of objects is crucial in these pieces. The piece by Sol LeWitt would not be the same if it was not on the walls of a room in which they could walk around in. The experience would be totally different if they could not be surrounded by this piece of art. The piece by Carl Andre shows how placing the object in the corner can create a new effect than a piece on a wall. Dan Flavin's piece has a special placement in which the light is able to better show in more places. The way they set up their art created a new awareness of existence and space. The audience walks in newly defined space on a path determined by the art. The pieces on this slide show how space can affect the experience. Being able to walk through the pieces creates a whole new level of depth of understanding. Scattering metal cubes on the ground gives a whole new meaning to the space, as the audience can walk through this and experience something different. Color. Color plays a very important role in a work of art, changing the work completely depending on the color. Two works of art that are identical in every way except in different colors are completely different works of art. Artists first began by painting the materials certain colors, but they felt that this hid the materials to some degree. The two pieces on this slide by Dan Flavin create totally different effects because of the difference in color. The two pieces by Donald Judd also have different effects due to the color. The red plexiglass reflects more light than the blue, showing how the color changes the experience of the art. This is why they began using materials that had their own color or materials that could have color incorporated into them. Most often used materials were colored plexiglass, galvanized metals, and neon lights, because these materials could be ordered in virtually any color, allowing for a plethora of new works of art. These pieces of art are made of materials that have the color incorporated into them. That way the color doesn't hinder the effect on the material itself. The fluorescent lights are able to be any color, but it's a part of the light, so there is no obstruction of the material. Meaning, minimalist works of art are separate and uninfluenced by the rest of the world. They do not take political, social, or psychological issues into account. They simply exist as objects, and they are defined by their relationship with space. Any particular piece makes no references or allusions to anything outside of itself. All allusion is avoided in minimalism, so nothing is hidden from the viewer. They also try to stray from expressionism, avoiding all metaphorical associations, spiritualism, and actual meaning. Donald Judd in particular does an excellent job of showing the audience exactly how the piece is made. In the orange cube, the semicircle is cut out so that the viewers can see exactly how the cube has been constructed, so there are no illusions or mysteries. In the pink plexiglass work of art, you can see through the plexiglass to see the wires that are holding it together. Once again, not hiding anything. Art is art, and everything else is everything else. Ad Reinhardt. Art excludes the unnecessary. Carl Andre. The art pieces on this slide have no other meanings. They are simply focused on being art, and that is it. They don't have any underlying meanings that are unrelated to art, which separates them from illusionism and expressionism, which often are created with a theme or topic, usually a social issue or event going on in the world at that time. Minimalist artists made a point to leave all of that out and stick to the basic elements of art. What you see is what you see, Frank Stella. These pieces once again show how there is no hidden meaning in the art. The only meaning in minimalist art is that of the elements combining together to create the complexity I mentioned earlier. Because little emotion or expression is displayed in minimalist art, there is very little revealed about the artist in the work. They wanted to remove themselves from the art, hoping to intensify the experience. The main idea of minimalism is this sort of truth to material, where the form of a sculpture is found in its material. By stripping the art down to simple forms, the artists believed that they were creating the possibility for a more direct and pure relationship between the viewer and the art, allowing the viewer to have a pure reaction to the art object itself. While you can look at these different works of art and know which of the artists created them due to their style, they tell you nothing about the artist. For example, when you see a piece of art with fluorescent lights, you can immediately identify it as a piece by Dan Flavin. But what does this tell you about him as a person? Nothing. It gives you no indication of his political or social opinions or his personal life. This is a defining element of minimal art, helping it to be art and only art. As you can see, minimalism is very different from other art forms in terms of the theory and meaning behind it. Most artists are concerned with trying to create art that has a deep meaning behind it. Oftentimes, art will allude to certain references or social issues. Other times, art is about aesthetics and beauty. Minimalism is not about any of those things. In fact, minimalist artists work to remove all of these things from their art, leaving it free of meaning beyond itself and its own elements. When you look at a box and wonder why the artist chose to make that piece of art, using those materials, in that color, and with that placement, it is not for any meaning other than for the construction of the piece. Nothing has any meaning other than its own qualities. The materials are chosen solely based on their constructional values and structural characteristics. The colors were purposely chosen to help define the materials, not hide them. They are also carefully chosen to not have any other meanings. For example, an artist does not use blue plexiglass as a symbol for sadness, or water, or beauty, or anything else that blue can be interpreted as. Blue was chosen simply so the viewer could experience the color blue. The placement is chosen to intensify the experience, not to mean anything else. There is nothing implied when a work of art is placed on the floor other than the fact that the viewer is equal to it. Being on the same level makes the work more relatable rather than placing it on a wall as though it is superior. Because in minimalism, all parts are equal, so we would not want the spatial element to be superior. All of this is the basis and the theory behind minimalism and what the minimalist artists were trying to achieve. Now Ashley is going to talk about 5 of the most prominent artists and analyze some of their most famous works of art.
The first artist I'll be talking about is Donald Judd. He was born on June 3rd, 1928. He spent most of his childhood time on his grandparents' farm, where he became aware of the physical world. Donald Judd earned degrees in philosophy and art history at Columbia University. Judd began his art career as an abstract expressionist painter and was known as being a rationalist. Later in his art career, he became known and regarded as the outstanding exponent of minimal art. Judd's artwork does not have autonomy or an internal system or meaning. The openness of Judd's work is a form of honesty and can then serve as models for society. He repeatedly stated his independence from minimal art. Instead, he wanted to focus on drawing attention to the importance of color in his work. His main focus as an artist was to deal with the problem of the colors of the objects in space. He used minimalist style so that color, not form, was the main focus. Judd once said, "Form is also color. Without color, there is no form. Form and color are one." He thought that the only way to get rid of any illusions in his artwork completely would be to have color in the material and the color be identical with the material. Judd believed that the different color configurations allowed for one concept to be redone multiple different times, each with different meanings. The only thing that would be different was the color. Judd wanted to avoid repetition of his work and combinations of colors. He once said that color is knowledge. The main colors Judd uses in his artworks are the color of light and cadmium red. Throughout his career, Judd did not believe that his artwork should be classified as minimalism. He tried to give the public what they wanted, and the public wanted simplicity. His artwork is simply to be seen, enjoyed, and judged only on its beauty and how it looks, and how it makes the viewer feel. An interesting quote from Donald Judd regarding his personal theory of minimalism says, "As I said before, the art is a whole thing in itself. It's not a medium for something else, so it's not teaching. It's not a moral thing. It's not an ethical thing. It's not a scientific thing. It's art. It's not about something else. It's about itself and its own qualities." The art form of pictorial composition, or paintings, and illusion had persisted throughout the art evolution. He wanted to distance himself from that and distance himself from European art history altogether. He had the personal feeling that he needed to make his artwork uniquely his own. Judd left painting on canvas for real space because he felt that easel and canvas painting created a hierarchy. He wanted his artwork to have a sensual property with the use of light and color. His first sculptures were made of wood and were painted the color cadmium red. Some other materials he used in many of his sculptures were aluminum, galvanized iron, stainless steel, and plexiglass. He used plexiglass for the shiny quality. Donald Judd criticized illusionism. He criticized the fact that illusionism disguises the actual conditions and qualities of the materials, mass, and color, and the construction of the artwork. Judd said, "Material, space, and color are the main aspects of visual art." The structure of his artwork is known for the openness. The form should be as clear as possible and reduced to make the most sense to the recipient. The materials used should be openly displayed and be recognizable to the viewers for their own intricate qualities. Judd also believed that 3D space is essential in his artwork. He said that actual space is intrinsically more powerful and specific than paint on a flat surface. The progression of his artworks followed the pattern 11, 1, 6, 2, 3, 3, 2, 6, 1, and every other number represents the object, and the remaining numbers are the spaces in his piece of work. This shows that his artwork is organized and mathematically logical, using sequences. He is famously known for his artwork of metal boxes on a wall, spaced out using this sequence. Judd left art in 1984 and began designing furniture. He died of lymphoma on February 12, 1994. The next artist I'm going to talk about is Frank Stella. Frank Stella majored in history and received his degree from Princeton. He is one of the most well-regarded post-war American painters. Frank Stella produced works which emphasized the picture as an object rather than the picture representing something else, physical or emotional. He made the art experience of materiality concrete, the paint as paint, and the canvas as canvas. Frank Stella made a departure from the technique of sketching out his work first, then painting. He said that a picture was a flat surface with paint on it and nothing more. This means that his works were no longer planned out beforehand, and that his artwork was the actual physical paint on the flat canvas. Frank Stella was interested in conceptual art and did not see himself as a minimalist artist. He impacted minimalism with his thoughts on art. His work influenced and inspired many other artists of the time period, such as Carl Andre, Donald Judd, and Michael Fried. When Stella first began producing artworks, he was focusing on the basic elements and principles of art, which are color, shape, and composition. Frank Stella is known as the father of minimalism, although he does not have the typical famous artist's attitude. Stella got embarrassed by his title as the father of minimalism because there were other minimalists before him and he didn't have a great commitment to the art movement, which wasn't even his idea to begin with. Frank Stella was a very competitive person with his artworks. He did not create art just for fun. He created art to be the best one at it. He was definitely known as the spokesman of minimalism, which fits into his competitive nature. Many of his friends teased him about being the father of minimalism, but the mother of maximalism. In the years between 1958 and 1960, Frank Stella produced a series of 23 black paintings. These paintings represented a maximum subtraction of color and design from the paintings. The black paintings marked Stella's arrival into the art world. Everyone that saw this thought that because the paintings were so simple-minded, Frank Stella's mind was as blank as the paintings. This series served as an important catalyst for minimalist art of the 1960s. Stella's paintings changed the notion of painting as a window onto 3D space, which lasted for many centuries after him. His black painting series consists of precisely delineated parallel black stripes that are produced by smooth black house paint. The striped pattern served as a regulating system. It was intended to emphasize the flatness of the canvas and prompt the viewer's awareness of painting as a 2D surface that is covered in paint. When he was talking about his own paintings, he said, "Illusionistic space out of the painting at a constant rate," meaning he wanted to show it being painted at a constant rate. Overall, Stella painted in a methodical, structured manner. He filled in regulated patterns with even strokes. His patterns were deduced from the actual shape of the canvas he was working on. His asymmetrical, irregular polygons explore the tension between the arrangement of colors on the flat surfaces of the canvas. Frank Stella dismantled the devices of 3D illusion. He underscored object-like nature of a painting. In the early years, Frank Stella started at a simple end of the spectrum and slowly ended his career with more and more complicated pieces of art, which is the opposite of what normal artists do. Dan Flavin studied painting and drawing at Columbia University. Dan Flavin is known for creating sculptural objects and installations by using fluorescent light bulbs and fluorescent light. He believed that abstract expressionism was too egotistical, so he moved away from that form of art. Dan Flavin admired Marcel Duchamp's ready-mades and was inspired by the way Marcel Duchamp created art with prefabricated raw materials. With these thoughts in his mind, Dan Flavin started rejecting studio production and preferred site-specific installations. He called these installations situations or proposals. A famous quote about art from Dan Flavin reads, "It is what it is and it ain't nothing else." He is giving his own definition on what art means to him, which contributes to the minimalist art movement. Dan Flavin used commercially available fluorescent light tubes to make his sculptures, which is an inspired idea from Marcel Duchamp. Flavin liked the tubing for its impersonal nature. The fluorescent tubes were a way for him to play around with space and light at the same time. Dan Flavin's signature artworks and mediums of art is the use of fluorescent light within the piece. Dan Flavin was classified as an artist by optical art, with optical effects, by taking fundamental concepts of style and translating them into works of art. His work with light waves demonstrated how the 2D illusionism was achieved. Light was the color, and color was the light. The interaction of both color and light either worked in harmony or dynamism as they played against one another within the art piece. Dan Flavin worked with prefabricated materials, which allowed him to focus on the actual light itself and the way in which that light is transformed. He denied that his light sculptures had any symbolic or dimension of meaning behind them, as many viewers would attempt to interpret a hidden meaning behind the pieces. The essential impermanence of the light artwork falls within the minimalist idiom. The tubes of light will eventually run out of energy and then will eventually burn out. Dan Flavin's legacy is not about his work as a minimalist artist, but because of his ability to look beyond the movement, even standing outside the realm of artistic movements. Sol LeWitt moved to New York City in 1953 and set up a studio there. While in New York City, LeWitt studied at the School of Visual Arts. At the same time, he was attempting to pursue his interest in graphic design at 17 magazine. By 1955, he was a graphic designer in an architect office. He then later got an entry-level job as a night clerk in 1960 at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. These early career experiences are what will influence him in his later works. All of his works of art were known as clinical, mathematical, and methodical. This can be interpreted by meaning that Sol LeWitt had specific directions he followed each time, and that the directions would rarely change. Sol LeWitt would write down the instructions to his artwork. This meant that the only thing that mattered in his artwork were the instructions that he wrote. LeWitt allowed the makers of his art to determine and interpret the instructions as they saw fit to do. He would not interfere, and it was completely up to the way in which they interpreted the directions. Sol LeWitt saw the interpretation by the art makers as part of the artistic process itself. This allowed his artwork to vary greatly in creativity from each piece depending on the different art makers' interpretations. Sol LeWitt realized later that art is just a passing pleasure.
Criticisms of art typically involve effects on observers, evolution of forms and techniques, and contrived analogies. With these in mind, minimalism wouldn't even be an art, which is what most critics have argued. This art, however, is made up of much more, because criticism doesn't typically include the object of art in terms of its own material individuality. The art wasn't criticized according to what the artist wanted it to signify, or rather, not signify. Therefore, artists did not like the word minimalist to be a label put on their work. Judd, Flavin, and LeWitt disapproved of the term greatly. Critics' main point against minimalism was the, quote, lack of art content, as I said earlier. Critic John Ashbery said what matters in art is an artist's will to discover rather than skills, which many other artists have. Minimalist artists were willing to go outside the box or stay in, depending on what they wanted to say, in order to show that everyday objects were beautiful and everything that they put out was aesthetic. Other critics of minimal art saw color as a way to distinguish different elements, and that was it. Color, however, was everything to Donald Judd. Many people simply did not understand what the artists intended for them to see, the beauty of the item they use, which includes the color. Michael Kimmelman, a New York Times critic, said, minimalism has become the default mode for our memorial culture, the proverbial blank slate onto which we inscribe what we want the future to remember about us. Many times, critics were wrong and publicly told so. As stated earlier, this was the first generation of university-educated artists, so naturally they wrote essays about their works. Many of these essays, explaining their inspiration and point, were able to silence the critics. By the 1970s, some artists thought that minimalism had thoroughly exhausted whatever formal and theoretical questions it had tried to answer or address. In 1979, New York critic John Perrault said, presently we need more than silent cubes, blank canvases, and gleaming white walls. We are sick to death of cold plazas and monotonous curtain wall, skyscrapers, as well as interiors that are more like empty meat lockers than rooms to live in.
I'm not going to have a quiz today.
Regardless, the thoughts and ideas of American minimalist artists influenced the next generation of artists around the world. Because of this, not all progressive artists abandoned minimalism. These artists enjoyed the clarity that could be derived from the total demand of submission to materials and the rules of space. As artists contrived their own meanings of art, post-minimalism does not denote a single style, but instead many different ones. Today, minimalism can be seen in other forms of art, including dance and music. It is no longer restricted to visual art. After artists began to abandon minimalism, process art, which focuses on the means and duration of the production, was developed. Starting in the late 1960s, observers' relationship to the space and form with artists associated with site-specific and the earthworks or land movement. An essential practice to many artists was still the expressive force of material objects, all while giving physical embodiment to an idea, emotion, or experience. Minimal art still influences the look of shopping malls, airports, corporate lobbies, public sculpture, and computer displays. Minimalism is still extremely popular in architecture. The Guggenheim Museum in New York is a great example of early minimalist ideas. It also still influences interior designs. The store IKEA sells a lot of minimalistic aspects of interior design.